I am Benjamin Gatling. I am an associate professor in the English department and a faculty affiliate of the Vural Center for Global Islamic Studies. On behalf of Peter Mandel, the director, and the other faculty and staff of the center, I want to welcome you to our talk today. We are very delighted to have with us Professor Marcia Hermansen of Loyola University in Chicago for a talk entitled American Muslim Negotiations of Authority in the Time of Coronavirus. If you are not already aware, I want to remind you all that the Ox Center has been sponsoring a series of talks since mid-June on COVID-19 and its broader impacts on Muslim communities and Muslim religiosity. If you have not already had the opportunity to do so, I would encourage you to go to our website, islamicstudiescenter.gmu.edu, and I believe Ashnar has put the link in the chat. And you can find links there to videos of our previous presentations, as well as a schedule of upcoming presentations. I am delighted today to introduce our distinguished guest, Professor Marcia Hermansen, Director of the Islamic World Studies Program and Professor in the Theology Department at Loyola University in Chicago. Professor Hermansen is the author of numerous books. By my count on her CV, I didn't ask her this if I was correct, by my count on her CV, she may be author editor of as many as 10 books. Her most recent book, published just this year, is Varieties of American Sufism. Professor Hermansen writes on Islamic thought, Sufism, Islam and Muslims in South Asia, Muslims in America, and women and gender in Islam. Professor Hermansen is going to talk for somewhere between 30 and 45 minutes, I understand, and then after that we will open up the floor for Q&A. I would just encourage everyone who's here to mute your microphone while Professor Hermansen is speaking, and you'll have plenty of opportunity at the end to unmute and ask Professor Hermansen your questions. So please join me in welcoming Professor Hermansen to George Mason University today. Please, Professor Hermansen.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction, and I'd like to thank the center for inviting me to participate in this distinguished series. I have a lot of images to show you. I kind of love visual things and talking about visual things. So I have multiple themes going on here, and I hope that as I go along, I may pique your interest, and do feel free to jot down whatever questions, or sometimes I'll ask you questions. There's many things that I haven't yet puzzled through myself. So this image from Masjid Omar, I grabbed way back in May sometime, and I actually revisited, and I think that's the theme of this talk, and just the theme of the whole coronavirus thing, right? This is an evolving thing. So this image is no longer on their website, but the rather ominous nature of the poor masjid being surrounded by the viral particles had grabbed my attention at that time. So some of the themes I'd like to go to, and again, keep your eyes on the screen because I will, in the interest of allowing time for questions, some of the images will be illustrative, and I tend not to read the text on the slides, and usually I don't have a lot of text on slides. Mercifully, it's image-based. But just a few ideas here are, again, this idea that this is an evolving situation. And in the course of the dramatic impact of the virus on everybody, and specifically on Muslim communities in the United States, what kind of discussions or tensions or negotiations have arisen. And a unifying theme for today will be authority, and then I'll wrap it up with some observations. So of course, we are living in a time of precarity, uncertainty, and adaptation. The normal is being questioned. And in the middle of all this, American Muslims, as other faith communities, as other people globally, are trying to navigate this new reality. So this was a screen share I grabbed pretty early on during the pandemic from a webinar on COVID sponsored by Stanford University. And what I found really helpful to my thinking, and this, by the way, was a presentation by Margari Hill from the Muslim Anti-Racism Coalition, this idea of, shall we say, a process, right? Like, was one ready for the pandemic? What were the initial reactions that the community or any group could take on? A later phase, and then post-pandemic recovery. And, you know, way back in April and May, it seemed like, you know, the end was imaginable. And I think we're in another, you know, another way of thinking about it now. So just to get personal in terms of self-situation, this was my zip code in April with 70 cases, in June with 1,000 cases. And very recently, boy, I should have checked today, we might have hit 1,500. But you notice that it has slowed down, I suppose, from exponential growth to steady growth at this point. You know, an observation that I was having, and then I found it confirmed in a piece that I encountered researching today's talk by Kambiz Ghania Basuri, is, you know, we're not really hearing, it's an election cycle, but we're not really hearing that much of the usual Islamophobic tropes and images and accusations. So I'd like to throw this out to you. Perhaps if you're interested, we can come back to this later. You know, why is there less Islamophobia? So Kambiz was saying, well, you know, because of the pandemic and because there was so much sympathetic media coverage of the pain of religious groups during this crisis that could have changed minds. Also, Muslims have been very well behaved. They haven't been insisting on opening up. You know, we've almost been like the model minority, the good guys during this, good religious guys and women, of course, during this pandemic. Also, the high proportion of Muslims in the medical professions, doctors in some of the states, more than 10%. Could there be an external political? So this could get a little edgy, but, you know, there's no more political capital, or maybe it's politically harmful to be Islamophobic at this time. Also, we're getting close to the election. Maybe this time Muslim voters are considered to matter. I leave you to think about that. Of course, early on, the pattern didn't completely go away, although it's been pretty quiet lately. You may recall the offensive tweet about mosques getting special privileges. So many of those who study, and of course media attention to Muslims early in the pandemic, focused on what would happen. And of course we know, and by the way, again, researching this talk, I found that there was you know, so much material from March and April, and, you know, so much media attention and even so much community discussion at that time, because of course it was the Ramadan period of the year. And it's been somewhat quieter since then in terms of that. But let's talk about fiqh and rituals and how that brings out some negotiation of authority. So of course there was an initial discussion around the Friday prayers. You know, what do you do if you can't go to the mosque? Okay, in fiqh terms, you cannot watch somebody on the screen. You may remember those kind of discussions. So you have the sort of genre of how to, you know, what do you do to do enough, or what do you do to do it properly? So we have here the idea of the individual Muslim being counseled in some way, or being advised of how to perform their religious obligations. But occasionally there were tensions involved in terms of the fiqh of rituals. So the North American Fiqh Council initially issued a fatwa, and here you may look at the writing on the slide. I've underlined what I want to draw your attention to. So their initial fatwa, and I screen grabbed it at the time, so I have the record, said that elderly adults, women, children, and individuals with symptoms should stop coming to the mosques. Okay. And of course, there was criticism about that, you're preventing women from coming to the mosques, or women are expendable or marginalized. So it was without fanfare altered, that it was no longer women, but it was mothers with small children. So that was very interesting in terms of authority and changing things. And this attention was given to this issue of female participation, both within intra-community discussion and in the broader national media. So there were articles written, for example, on the fact that initially, when going to the mosque was not possible, some male Muslims were saying, well, it really doesn't count if it's an image on the screen. How can I, do something virtually? But women had been going to the mosques for years and sitting in a basement or sitting upstairs and watching a TV screen. So there was increased awareness of that gender disparity, right? Things got shaken up in a number, and as things became shaken up nationally, things became shaken up in the Muslim community as well. So the experience of Ramadan under the lockdown had a kind of shift, how the home could be a sacred site, how Muslims could benefit from this experience. And you also had a proliferation of manuals, self-help literature, and a concern with Muslim mental health. So again, you see, so in terms of this theme for today of authority, notice that this is not a fiqh, not like what are the rules, but it's more, a friendly, informed, kind of collective, not one authority figure, and not even an imam necessarily, or a fiqh expert, but telling one how to navigate through Ramadan. And others than myself have noticed the sudden acceptance of female authorities, clinical psychologists, medical professionals, nurses, and the bar of those females who were invited speakers. They no longer had to conform to a particular anticipated wearing Islamic dress and so on. So there was also this, kind of healthy Ramadan, mental health, having a routine during Ramadan. So this manual that went well beyond the discourse of fiqh. Now, this is an example of the sympathetic, media coverage, in this case, the New York Times. So we moved through Ramadan. So I'm going through the past couple of months for the community, and how these discussions have emerged and changed, and how there have been negotiations of authority. So some of these images are Chicago situated, so I hope you're interested in Chicago. So this was one of our local Islamic Muslim Educational Center, how to celebrate Eid. Well, why not have a drive-through? And these are actually memes of well-known figures in the community. So you had various drive-by Eids, and then the yearly ritual cycle continued. 6 weeks or 2 months later, you had the Eid al-Adha and the Hajj, and again the how are you going to somehow celebrate when you can't get together for the prayer? Well, you can have drive-through for the kids, or have some other kind of celebration. So now we come to the topic of the sober topic of death, burials, and funerals. And of course, at a time such as the pandemic, the nearness of death or the anticipation of tragedy was very poignant for the community. And there was anxiety. So initially, if persons unfortunately pass away due to coronavirus, how will they be treated in an appropriate ritual way by Muslims? And again, you have the self-help, you have the manual, you have guidance for individual mosques for people who are concerned about this. So I'd like to mention in terms of funerals, something from my own experience, rather than media or websites and so on. I actually had attended 2 funerals during the pandemic. And I'm calling what happened the shift to cemetery. So people no longer gathered in the mosque for the funeral prayer. Rather, the family or friends would convene at the actual burial place. Who decided this? It was not, a pronouncement of fiqh or somebody saying this is what you should do. It was kind of a negotiation of what was culturally expected, what the family discussed among themselves, and then how the actual burial took place also had to be negotiated in terms of the rules of the cemetery. So in one of the cases, a large family convened at the cemetery for the burial, and the cemetery had American officials who told people that only 15 people at a time could go to the graveside because that cemetery was visible to the neighbors and the police might be called if there were large gatherings of people. But also at that particular burial, they had groups of men come up, and then after that, groups of women to pray at the graveside, which is, and again, of course, this varies even in normal times, depending on the community, the family, the expectations. But I thought it was interesting in terms of authority, who decided, who knew what to do? Because in the case of the second burial that I attended, there were no females there except a couple, including myself, who were basically drivers of cars and were clearly not expected to exit their cars. So I saw this pattern of the car and the drive-by and wondered how that figured in a sense of gendered space or sacred space, or how things, how meanings were interpreted by the community of what were normal ritualized or gendered behaviors. So of course, there has been this expectation of reopening and a new normal. And while there have been reopenings, I don't think we've quite come to a normal or how long that normal will continue. So some of the local here in this region Islamic centers opened in a partial way. Some of them opened with fairly stringent rules like registering ahead of time. And again, these rules were developed in terms of the authority of the state regulations and the common sense of the congregation, and some members of the community who wanted to attend that prayer. So there were also graphics, to describe what that preparation should be. Now I'd like to slightly shift from that cycle of negotiations of ritual behaviors and fiqh over time to a discussion of activism in the Muslim community and how that also relates in some senses to authority. The question is, what is activism? And I'm going to talk about that when I show you the next slide. Both Islamic organizations, mosques, institutions, and individuals found themselves in new roles during the pandemic and also found themselves forging new alliances. You may have seen, and if not, I'm showing you something new. This is the ISPU research organization graphic off their website of a map of US, American Muslim responses to COVID-19, types of service. Now, I thought the types were very interesting. So this is, the premise of this is self-reporting. Individuals log in on behalf of themselves or their organization, and they report where they are, and did they do educational service, food service, medical, spiritual service. And then this is developed, and you can scroll through and see every state and statistics, but these categories become very interesting. So you can select and deselect. And the question is, what counts as spiritual service, right? What does spiritually mean? I mean, perhaps food service is a little more clear what that might mean. But the categories themselves, and also this idea of self-reporting. I thought that was interesting in terms of authority, that I can say, yes, I have done this particular kind of, so is it an Islamic service, or is it a Muslim has done this sort of service, and all of this accumulates, and the purpose of this accumulation is to demonstrate that Muslims are good people, that Muslims are part of the American fabric, that Muslims are fulfilling their religious obligations. So I was intrigued by the whole, concept of this accumulation and collection of data, and how it would then be interpreted. So of course, part of authority at the national level, I'm sure many of us are aware of the tensions around science, who listens to science and who perhaps listens to some other source of authority of how people should be behaving. And of course, Muslims are disproportionately publicly in the media and on the front lines in terms of scientific and medical expertise. As I already mentioned previously, something has shifted in the Muslim community in terms of gender. So you have public expertise on the part of women in areas. So in other words, the religious now includes scientific expertise. This is a service to the community. This is activism. And therefore, Muslim women of all types can find themselves publicly represented. And of course, even in the media, even in the mainstream American media, you have Muslim voices. So this YouTube video is very interesting to analyze in terms of authority. It is a discussion between Yazhar Qadhi, the religious authority, and Dr. Asim Padella at the University of Chicago, a biomedical ethics doctor, expert. And again, I can only, in the interest of time, explain very briefly what one can learn about negotiation of authority during the pandemic. Because here you have two voices, religious voice, scientific voice, but what they share, and of course, a mixture on both sides beyond that. So I'm bifurcating perhaps excessively. But the issue is, during the pandemic, how do you advise Muslim families about end-of-life issues, about medical decisions, and in some cases, even the necessity of accepting medical interventions. So each figure establishes his authority, but Dr. Qadhi, especially for the Muslim audience, makes it very clear that Dr. Padella is more than an ordinary medical expert, because he has Islamic studies training, because he aspires to be a hafiz and has already memorized large portions of the Quran. So the idea is that one can trust his authority, beyond the scientific realm. But another very interesting aspect of this conversation between the two of them, in terms of our theme of authority, is that there's a kind of disclaimer, that do not simply listen to this video and assume that on your own you can now make an informed Islamic ethical decision about a medical procedure, because each case is individual and you should be speaking to your own imam or religious authority, and of course medical professionals to make those kind of decisions. So we see the idea of a trusted science coming from a pious person, but we also see each of these individuals in their role as advisors and chaplains aware of the very weighty responsibility that they have at all times, but especially during the pandemic. So in terms of activism, these just very quickly are slides, the food distribution of various Muslim communities. And then I get to the theme of expansion and alliances. So normal relief of ICNA relief, I recently, just a week or so ago, a local representative of ICNA relief was saying before the pandemic, they were serving 500 families in food distribution, and now they're serving 5,000. So, you know, a massive change in terms of the need for this kind of practical activism. But then this is a screen grab from the physicians of Pakistani descent in North America, again, a fairly local meeting. But over here at the top of the slide on the right, you have the representative of ICNA Relief discussing the collaboration between the Pakistani physicians and ICNA, which is largely part of it is fundraising and supporting the food distribution that ICNA is doing. But then the physicians themselves have started a COVID advice line. So people can call this line, and there's a tree of advice about people having symptoms and what they should do. So there's an overlap. I'm positing that there's an overlap between, of course, Muslim ethnic Pakistani identity in this sort of activism in the community. So let me give you some examples of community and identity. This is the billboard of ICNA again, and they switched the billboard you know, to speak to pressing issues of the day. So after the coronavirus billboard, where they are demonstrating that Islam has relevant teachings of how to comport oneself during a pandemic, later on, during the period of racial tensions, they switched to a billboard about Islamic teachings on racial harmony. Mujahid Biliji, who's done some very interesting sociological work on American Muslims during the pandemic, has coined this formulation, the response to the pandemic, that Islam is a validation. So the ICNA billboard is a sort of, you know, we already have these teachings in Islam about how to comport oneself during a pandemic. You have a Dawah conference from ICNA that Islam is the solution in times of confusion. Again, the validation, if you will, of religion as a response to the crisis of the pandemic. Now, of course, there's been all kinds of individual communities, racial, sectarian, and so on, responding. And one of the more effective ones has been the National Black Muslim COVID Coalition. You also have for Latino Muslims. So you have more recognition, I would argue, of sub-communities during the time of the pandemic. These communities were there, but even more of a sense of a necessity for outreach. And then subgroups, like the survey, which, by the way, is another feature. Remember, I showed you the slide about the activism and people signing up and explaining the kind of activism they were doing during the pandemic. Well, this sort of process of feedback and surveys. So here the Muslim students were surveyed about their mental health and the way that they were feeling during the stress of the COVID period and everybody going online and being isolated and so on. So now I come to the sectarian diversity and authority. Well, what is the role of overseas fatwas? If a particular group cites Al-Azhar or Shi'i authorities, or in the case of Zaytuna Institute, the United Arab Emirates, for their fatwas on prayer and mosque attendance and so on during the pandemic, that of course gives a signal to where they look for authority. So this is a joint statement of various Shia Muslim groups in North America about how religious practices should be conducted during the pandemic. And I, again, in researching this talk, might not have known that the local Shi'i community, or at least one of the masajid here, conducted their Ashura ritual at the mosque, but outside and socially distanced and mosque wearing. And you can see this video on YouTube. So I thought that was also very interesting in terms of ceremonies coming outside of the religious space and being performed quasi-publicly and then being recorded and being made available, which of course reached not only the members of the community. By the way, I took, these are screen grabs from the video that one can find on YouTube. And that there are actually many women participating, although the camera does not always focus on them. So now American Sufis, which is one of the 30s. Among American Sufi groups, particular Sufi orders may themselves invoke one or another kind of authority, whether it's charismatic power of the sheikh, whether it's the fact that if you follow their path of Sufism, you are reforming the self through Sufi psychology, whether their orientation is to be traditionalist and often to have a very strong ecological teaching, friendliness to the environmentalism and so on. So if you are familiar with the Naqshbandi Haqqanis, this is the late Sheikh Nazim, and you may know that this tariqah always had a millenarian teaching going back to the Sheikh of Sheikh Nazim, Sheikh Abdullah Dagestani. So during the pandemic, these apoplectic sayings were recovered and projected again. And this is another YouTube video where in, I believe, 2011, the Sheikh in one of his talks mentioned the virus. And then early on, his successor, Sheikh Hisham Kabani, has a talk, Allah's power is shown through a tiny virus. But then this was elaborated in a statement, the prediction of the Grand Sheikh, that 1 out of every 7 people will pass away. And now you have even more elaborate YouTube videos. And it is very interesting, YouTube, when anything's about COVID, they have this little disclaimer. So this does not come from the Sufi Tariqa, but it comes from, I suppose, YouTube. They have to put that on. So there is an entire talk in Arabic that with translation, again, invoking this prediction of the Sheikh, the coming of the Mahdi, and time to prepare for the last days. The Inayatiyya Sufi order, that's the Hazrat Inayat Khan, and now the latest successor, Zia Inayat Khan, has a strong response to the coronavirus. One may say this is a more universalist Sufi order. They have a healing branch, and they have special classes in Sufi healing with a weekly concentration for healing, especially to those impacted by the virus. They also have special talks on this. Yet another American Sufi order, the Maktaba Tariqa Uvaisiya, which is a strong Iranian-American formation, shall I say, has an emphasis on Sufi psychology. They're offering free courses. They also offered meditation sessions for doctors and nurses during Ramadan. And some of the other Sufi orders have talks about ecology, and this is the Golden Sufi Order, talk by their leader on the virus and what happens next, but usually an ecological focus. So I'm about to wrap up now with some general conclusions, and I will acknowledge here that some of these ideas I took. Now there's actually a publication by Mujahid Biliji, but this was from his talk in the Stanford webinar, where he observed that there's a challenge to authority because Muslims can now go anywhere to hear a talk, to hear a khutbah. Now, of course, that was there before, but many people would prefer to go to their local mosque. Now you search around online. These talks become more differentiated. I would add the observation that you have many more female voices, many more African-American Muslim voices. But again, in the sermonizing and beyond that, in all of this self-help literature and manuals, what is the authority behind the manuals? And do the Muslims who are using them ask? We know that throughout history, plagues have shaken up societies, religious communities, and their institutions. So we expect challenges to authority. And when institutions cannot operate in their usual way and rituals cannot be performed as they had been, it opens new possibilities and negotiations for how these should ideally be conducted. Another reaction to plagues historically was that minorities have been targeted, scapegoated. For example, think of the Middle Ages and the persecution of Jewish communities. So it could be that some of the strategic response of Muslims in the United States to conform and not challenge the direction, the directives of the state and so on, is to avoid being targeted. And thus far, hopefully that has not been the case. Conspiracy theories proliferate, and I'm reminded here of there's I believe it's, like a blog post of Imam Zaid Shakir, where in Ramadan he's saying, everybody's checking their WhatsApp and listening and spreading fake news about the virus instead of praying. And finally, of course, plagues lead to asking the deep existential questions. Where are we going? What does this all mean? Are we in the time of the last days? Is this a wake-up call to be kinder to nature? Is it an opportunity to look inside and become more pious and better Muslims? So investigating, and of course, this is going to unroll and unravel over a long period, but one does find, emerging, shall we say, the theodicies coming from various positions in the community. And with that, I conclude, and thank you very much for your attention. And now we can take questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Hermansen, for a very stimulating talk. To all of you, I invite you now to ask Professor Hermansen questions. Feel free to post a question in the chat bar, and I can read it and direct it to Professor Hermansen. You're also more than welcome to turn on your video and ask your question directly to Professor Hermansen, or ask your question directly to Professor Hermansen without turning on your video. I would ask you to use the raise hand feature in Zoom, and then I can acknowledge you before you answer the question, so we're not talking over each other. So please, the floor is now open for questions and discussion.
Everybody's quiet. It's like my students.
Right. Well, maybe I can
Oh,
ask a
Dietrich
question.
has
Oh, Dietrich, perfect. Dietrich, feel free to ask your question.
Yes, I was just switching on the mic. Sorry. Can you hear me?
yes.
Yes, yes. I just had a very simple question. Was there any evidence of tension between the different sectarian orientations during this time, as we unfortunately had seen in Pakistan and other Muslim countries, or any other inner and inter-Muslim calamities which were making it more difficult?
Let me think about, welcome to throw it open to the group, but I think in the context of American Muslims, again, I think there are a number of things going on, which, first of all, there wouldn't be that much context for those kind of clashes, and because there isn't. I mean, it's not Pakistan, and Muslims are a minority in the United States, and people, kind of do their own rituals and go to their own mosques, and that kind of differentiation of where they participate. So, if anything, I think Muslims think of themselves as kind of being on the same team, so to speak, in the United States.
Professor Hermansen, there's a question in the chat from Anna, and Anna asks, she says, thank you for a stimulating talk. She says, please, could you say a few words about how you think the pandemic will affect minority Muslim experiences as far as religious practices is concerned?
Could you I'm not quite sure what is meant by minority, which minority of Muslims, like a sectarian race, right? Because I don't think it means all Muslims, correct? So I would request a clarification.
It looks like Anna may have dropped out. Oh, there, I see her there, Anna. There we go. Anna says, yes, I'm thinking probably women.
Okay, well, actually, that's a topic on which there's been some interesting writing, both by Muslim women themselves, blogging, and I'd be happy to share if you want to contact me, some sites for that. But also this kind of outside media had zeroed in on that. At least I know in Chicago, there was an article, I believe in the Chicago Tribune, where they interviewed some of the local Muslim women activists who were trying perhaps to get something positive out of this, very challenging situation. And saying now that men have been deprived of full physical participation at the mosque, they can understand what women have been experiencing all along. Or for example, in Ramadan, and now I'm remembering one of the anecdotes that, the husband says, after the big Ramadan iftar, normally the husband would rush off to the mosque to pray Tarawih, and the woman would be at home with the children cleaning up the mess. And, so the husband says, wow, now I know what it was like for you all these years, because I can't go to the mosque and I'm here and I see that you're stuck here cleaning up. Of course, not that happened in every family all the time, but that's sort of where, men got to walk in women's shoes, or experience what it was like to be deprived of full participation in rituals. Now, will that, so there's then the sub-questions to all of these: will things change if we ever get back to normal? So part of it, if we ever get back to normal, will mosques be more welcoming to women, to people of color, to disabled people? And there's actually a series of seminars from ISPU about that very topic. If we ever get out of this, will women be given, a better situation of the mosque? Or all of those things are out there. So those conversations are happening.
Professor Hermansen, it looks like Anna also mentioned something about African American Muslim converts. I don't know if you want to speak to that issue.
Yeah, well, you should definitely go to the ISPU website, because they had a series how to make your mosque more welcoming to women, how to make your mosque more welcoming to people of color. So they are asking those hard questions. There's more awareness. Now, race is a huge topic, and I'm not sure in your series at George Mason, I think you've probably already had a presentation on American Muslims, race, and the coronavirus, because certainly that's been a large part of the discussion even before the George Floyd killing. You know, there was already again, that I kind of anticipated that with the slide from Marguerite Hill, that the Muslim Anti-Racism Coalition, so you can go to their website, ARC, Muslim ARC, ARC, had already been doing fantastic work in educating the community about issues of race. So they were kind of ready to take this on, and those very intentional resources and seminars and presentations are there. So there may, you know, hopefully the same kind of conversations that are being held at universities, like, you know, how can we be better in terms of issues of race in aware Muslim communities? Those conversations are also happening.
Professor Hermansen, it looks like Ahmed Salim has a question for us. Please.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Hermansen. This is amazing. And then just to follow up, I think Anna also had dropped in the African American Muslims question in her comment, and she will be speaking in the series later. But also, Dr. Kamida Rashad was a previous speaker in the series, and she brought in survey results from the Black COVID, I think, survey, which I'll encourage everyone to also look at. My question is a bit of a comparative nature, and I will understand if you haven't looked at that, but I'm also curious what other faith traditions, discussions around authority, deliberations might look similar to the American Muslims. I don't know if you have had the chance to look at, or if you know of individuals who might be doing comparisons among different Protestant or Catholic denominations. Obviously, I think we're watching the Brooklyn's, you know, Orthodox community and their reaction and their struggle with the COVID situation. So just that question, whether, you know, on these questions of authority and deliberations, whether there are any comparative perspectives you might keep in mind. So that would be my question. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's a huge question, and maybe you can find someone who works on that. But my mind went to a couple of places when you asked that, and I'm not sure if they all answer your question. You know, if you think of the rituals, a lot of this does go around rituals, you know, especially attending places of worship, right? Attending places of worship, and how specific religious communities and then sub-communities. So you mentioned the Orthodox Jewish community in Brooklyn, for example, that, you know, it almost becomes a badge of honor, like we have to attend services, you know, God will take care of us. Hopefully I'm not stereotyping that community. And of course we might have expected, for example, American Tabligis to kind of have the same, you know, the same attitude that, you know, going to the mosque or going for Tabligh above all. But it seems that on the whole, as far as I know, and of course, America's a big place and there may be plenty of things that I don't know. I would imagine that there's more pressure to open up and have more mosque attendance. Just anecdotally, I won't say it's a Tablighi mosque, but locally in Chicago, a mosque that's perhaps a little more ethnic and urban. The congregation is meeting again, and I'm not sure what kind, maybe mask wearing, or, you know, but they are certainly not as strict about social distancing and registering ahead of time as the congregation of professionals, you know, Arab American professionals out in the suburbs. So there may, you know, there are a lot of dynamics, I think, going on here in terms of class. ideas of religious authority and what is absolutely necessary according to religion. I'm not sure of the parallels in the Jewish community. I will say anecdotally, I live in a neighborhood in Chicago that's very heavily Orthodox. And actually right now it's the festival of Sukkot. If you're familiar, people build a little tabernacle, which is like a little shelter outside in their backyard, and people come over and get together. Actually, that works fairly well with COVID, as long as you don't crowd your little booth too much. It's outside, you know, it's usually friends and family, so that's a ritual that can adjust to being outside. During Rosh Hashanah, there were signs all over the neighborhood, people are going to blow the horns on the corner. But actually, I went out and I couldn't find any horns. So it also depends on the ritual and how well that ritual translates to being performed in a different kind of space or publicly. So that's why I was interested in the car idea. You know, just as a revival of drive-in theaters, if you may know that, you probably know, like a lot of South Asian Muslim women would not go to the cemetery, right? It's almost like a taboo, at least at the burial time. But if you go in your car, it's almost like the car becomes a kind of purdah. So that changes a gender dynamic of the performance. But I don't know about the comparison. Of course, we do know that certain evangelical Christian congregations made it a point of wanting to open up, right? We must open up. So it became politicized, right? Opening and going. So religion in America is imbricated with politics in certain ways that symbolically returning to your religious practice is identified with supporting, I don't know, the Republican agenda, let's just be blunt, or something like that. So maybe that's also why Muslims are not pressing to open up. And God knows, it's complicated. It'll take a while to figure out all these strands. I guess you'd have to actually go there and interview people.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Professor Hermansen, there's a question from Nancy in the chat. Nancy, I don't know, you have a number of questions there. I don't know if you maybe want to turn on your microphone for a second and ask one of your questions, or if you're available, Nancy, maybe you can turn on your microphone and do that. If not, I'll try to pull a question out. So Nancy asks that she's intrigued, she says, by the theory that COVID has threatened authority because congregates could shift virtually to any imam and were no longer limited to their local one. Given the fiqh discussion you gave, an overview of that indicated most scholars did not condone shifting sermons and prayers virtually, and that mosques began to reopen safely to allow congregants for talks and Friday prayers. Why would they seek to replace their imam is the question. And then she has some series of follow-up questions here. Why might they be seeking to replace their imam? Were they perhaps leveraging the additional programming in addition to their local regular practice? Perhaps two, if this took place, was there gender distinction? I don't know, Professor Hermansen, how you might respond to some of those questions.
Let me quickly try to answer it. It might just be, you know, maybe I slightly misspoke, or we're talking about two different things. So the idea of choosing your imam is not necessarily, I mean, there is a question, will people ever go back to the mosques in the same way? So they will go back to the mosque, but they will demand that things change. So one thread is the sort of reflections by so-called unmosqued Muslims, or say, you know, I went to the mosque and the Friday sermon was always really lame. And I didn't feel that I was being spiritually fulfilled there. And now during the period of coronavirus, I'm going on YouTube and I'm listening to, you know, a virtual seminar, and I'm finding great edification. And now that I've felt that, you know, sense of something that really responded to what I want in my religion, I can't go back, you know, to that corner mosque and listen to that canned sermon every Friday, but I might seek out another mosque. I'm not going to say fire this imam, but I might, vote with my feet if I can go somewhere else. But in the meantime, during the pandemic, since I can't go anywhere, I might as well go somewhere to listen to what I like. I think that's the answer. So there's this idea of people having more. Now, of course, many of these things were already out there, but perhaps people were not pushed, they went to their corner mosque because, well, that's what you do, and I know everybody there, but that might shift now. I believe that was the point.
Omer has a question. He says he works as a college Muslim chaplain, and one of the overwhelming concerns from our students is seeking out some semblance of community. They feel desperately alone. From your experience, have you found similar sentiments from other segments of the Muslim community?
Let me think about that for a minute. I think everybody feels that, especially one, outside of your nuclear, I mean, everyone has a different situation and people make different choices, but I think you kind of become very distanced from your extended family, so we went through the period of funerals and, basically you Zoom. And I mean, I will say in some of the Zoom, by Zoom funeral, I don't mean the actual rites of the funeral. I mean, let's say after the funeral and the burial, there's some kind of either, the khatam, the conclusion of reading the Quran ceremony or something like that. Everybody logs in on Zoom. And in this case, you had people logging in from India and Pakistan and, various places who probably wouldn't have Zoomed. Previously people might have called each other, but to sort of have everybody together. So in a way, it facilitated a new form. I mean, that's the thing, right? It facilitated a new form of community. But of course, it's not the same as actually seeing your family or in the drive-by funeral, like waving to them from your car window. It's sort of come to that level. I think I think for the students, and of course, that's why they did the survey of student well-being. So I think many of us here are academics and maybe some are students themselves. I think this semester it's than the spring semester, right? Because it's gone on for so long, and the end is perhaps not in sight. And I think it's very difficult for the students to be disrupted and to have so much uncertainty at that time in life when the expansiveness, right? Youth wants expansiveness and connection and dreams and waking up every morning and like something great and new is going to happen. And sometimes I think about the generational thing, right? Like, of course, if you're older, you're more scared of dying from COVID, but you also, you're not sort of like, oh my goodness, I'm missing out. You don't have that missing out. So perhaps it's almost as a chaplain, how to counsel the students in such a way that they don't suffer so much from feeling that they're missing out. And I'm not sure what the answer to that is. And of course, I'm sure all you get together, but our chaplain, so is having a lot of online activity and games and get together for the students. So that I think in some ways the Muslim students have more of a community, at least if they have a chaplain, working with them in sort of intentional ways of building community. So keep up the good work and keep those students hopeful and engaged. Mariam has a question. Oh, you're muted, Benjamin.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that's the perpetual thing. Am I muted? Am I not muted? I think we have time for one more very short question and maybe one more very short answer, and then we can dismiss.
There's a hand up.
Right, for Miriam. Miriam, if you'd like to ask a short question, and we have time, I think, for Professor Hermansen to provide a short answer.
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum assalam.
So that was so amazing.
Oh, thank you.
So with the reopening of some masajid and women not being specifically allowed in back in, and some folks having to sue particular masajid so that they can attend these risky Jumu'ah sessions, I am totally confused at the understanding or the reasoning of what that has to do with anything. And hold on one moment, there's a fire truck going by. I'm just going to pause for just a second. Okay, got it. And so one of the things that I've heard is, well, it's mandatory for men to attend Salatul Jumu'ah, and nobody's arguing that. So I'm just not understanding, what does that have to do with anything? And is the participation that you highlighted with Sheikha Tamara Gray and other female scholars, is this the increase in participation? Is it because of the optics, or are we responding to criticisms of lack of women scholars participation, or is there really an opening?
Okay, thank you for your question. That was quite long and complex. I'm not sure if I definitely got the end point about the question, so the female scholars. I think it's about authority, because remember, most of those optics of female scholars were like medical expert, mental health expert. So she, this abstract female scholar, is not necessarily competing, in the realm of fiqh, or maybe I shouldn't say competing, professing. I'm not saying she couldn't be, and definitely you have the sort of circles of ustaza so-and-so or sheikha so-and-so. So, I mean, after all, there are more female scholars than there used to be. And I think just as they kind of walk back or nuance walk, so it's not women don't go to mosques, it's women with small children. I think now, you may remember, or some of you may know, what was, I don't remember, 2 years ago or whatever, they either have a poster with all men on it, right? Like for an Islamic event, right? And it's Sheikh so-and-so and this guy and that guy, or they might have one woman, but they won't show her picture. They'll have like a little round, cartoon thing, because you can't show a woman's face. I mean, that, so this kind of erasure, but that had been so heavily criticized. I mean, I think now, even in mainstream academia, right? Back in the day, you would have panel after panel that was all men and the respondent was male and so on. And then now it's pretty hard to do that. Like people will start, that doesn't look good, right? And so I think with that general change in the American context, these are Muslims living in America, and I think the new generation is pretty aware that there has to be female. And it's like race, right? Initially, you might say, "Wow, it's tokenism," but it ends up being more than tokenism. Just like I think so many universities are having that conversation now in terms of hiring, right? We've got to hire more people of color. Well, usually those ceilings are broken when you have ethnic studies and when you have these fields, and then you'll have diversity in all fields. But often it has to be kind of a niche. So maybe the female scholars, the niche, that sort of hardcore fiqh thing, okay, let's start with mental health and experts and women doctors. It's pretty clear that half the doctors are women. So, and God knows better, right? Something like that.
Thank you very much, Professor Hermansen, for your time today. Thank you for a very stimulating talk. Thank you for joining us here at George Mason University today. Before we dismiss this afternoon, I did want to make everyone aware of the next talk in our COVID series on October 21st. Our very own Courtney Hughes-Rinker, a cultural anthropologist and director of the Global Affairs program here at George Mason University, will be giving a talk entitled, "Not Only Are We Already Here, You're All Muslim, Salam Brother, the Islamic Nature of the New Normal in COVID-19, and exposing the conflation of religion, race, and culture." So I hope you'll join us. I believe the link is now posted there in the chat. Aishner, Ahmad Salem, I don't know if there's anything else, any other business that we need to cover before we leave.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gatling, and thanks so much, Hermansen. We hope to see everyone at the next session. Thank you for that information. Good afternoon and take care.
Thank you for coming, everybody, and stay safe.
Thank you so much, everyone. Bye.